scripting. So we're going to be taking elements in of what is PowerShell, essentially, how do you use it with the Office 365 platform, and then give you some ideas about how you can get information out of Office 365 with PowerShell, and then how you can manipulate objects in Office 365 as well. It's being presented by myself, Alan Byrne, and Vasil Mishev. We're both Office 365 MVPs, and we've been doing PowerShell stuff pretty much for the last 5 or 6 years, as long as we have been using Office 365. We have quite a comprehensive background from the history of Cogmotive, which is an Office 365 reporting platform dealing with large numbers of users, large tenants, and Vasil's background as well as a consultant working for HP and other integrators, just managing customer environments, trying to automate things so you don't have to manually click the admin portal, wait for the little spinny thing to finish, and things that we do repetitively. We're by nature lazy people. We don't want to do the same thing over and over again, and PowerShell gives us an easy way to automate common tasks and to standardize certain things so that anyone can really do them. So next slide, please, Vasily. Here we go. So what is PowerShell? I mean, it's 2017. If you're a sysadmin, you really should know what PowerShell is and how to use it. I think that I'm quite harsh on this. If you don't have a grasp of the basic concepts of PowerShell, you really have no business being a senior systems administrator or anyone in that type of role. Every single Microsoft product these days is going to be coming with some sort of PowerShell interaction, even third-party PowerShell. Even third-party products such as ours support PowerShell, and it usually allows you to automate any kind of sort of system integration tasks. It started off as an Exchange Online tool, Exchange on-prem tool. Exchange was the first product within Microsoft to really support PowerShell, and if you've been an Exchange admin, you'll remember that once we switched away from Exchange 2003, all of the GUI dialogues inside the Exchange admin console would actually show you what PowerShell commandlet it was running underneath the hood. And that was Microsoft's way of trying to get you to dip your toe in the water of PowerShell. You can see that every single button you clicked, every single action that you took in Exchange would actually be something that was running in PowerShell underneath. More and more workloads adopted that. It's now built into Windows. It has been for some time now. And for anyone who's ever used DOS or any other kind of shell, it's relatively easy to use and master. Every single commandlet, and I shouldn't be having to tell you these guys, but every single commandlet, which is a thing that you can run in PowerShell, has that sort of noun and verb component. So it's usually get hyphen something, set hyphen something, new hyphen another thing. And what makes it really different from some of the other shells that people use in Linux is that you can actually pipe an object between different commandlets. In Linux world, you have to pipe big strings of text and then sort of manipulate that as a string in order to get information out of it. With PowerShell, you can pipe one object into another object, pull out properties, and it really makes it easy to get information from one system into another, or from from a user into a mailbox, for example. It's supported even on Linux now, Mac. You can run it on Azure, and you can also run it, on any Windows server as well. It's really, really important for automating things. So something that you don't want to mess up, something that is quite manual a lot of the time, such as bringing a user into Office 365, onboarding a new user. So you want to create a user account. You want to then assign a license to that user account. You want to set some Active Directory properties. You then want to enable, say, an archive mailbox or different types of legal hold. This is something you would do multiple times a day in a large organization as a sysadmin. So you can actually automate that. Just have a script, pipe in the users that you want to do, and then run them over and over again without accidentally forgetting to do a step or missing something there. It's really great for doing manipulations on lots of objects as well. So in the Office 365 admin portal, if you need to enable legal in-place hold, for a large number of mailboxes, it's quite cumbersome to do. Mailbox auditing is another. Turning that on for all of the mailboxes in your organization is kind of impossible to do through the Exchange admin console that's available online. You need to bulk that up, batch that up into a PowerShell command or a PowerShell script. You can also use it to do custom reporting on Office 365, and that's what we'll be spending some time on today. And then one of the most powerful things of PowerShell is you're not just limited to what is available out of the box in PowerShell. You can bring in third-party DLLs, .NET things. You can do API calls to third-party services. You can connect into all kinds of different programming style languages just through the console itself, just through PowerShell itself, by loading in different libraries, loading in different DLLs. And we'll show a little bit of that as we come along later as well. Next one, please, Vasil.
Thank you, Alan, for this introduction. So before we actually start talking about how PowerShell applies to the Office 365 administrator, just a few more words on the tools that you can use for scripting. So PowerShell is basically text-based. As Alan mentioned, you have the noun-verb syntax, so you enter the commandlet, you enter some parameters, then magic happens. So as a text-based shell, you can actually use any text-based editor to work with PowerShell, but of course we have some more powerful tools. The built-in one is the PowerShell Integrated Scripting Environment, or the ISE. It's my tool of choice, for example, but there are other tools out there which other people might find more convenient. For example, I know that Alan is a fan of the new VS Code tool. There are also some third-party tools or add-ins that will extend the functionality of the integrated scripting environment. There are even some UI builder tools, because as Alan just mentioned, PowerShell is not limited to just text, not limited to even just objects, but you can actually build dialogues in it, you can build different forms with controls and so on. Now, when you're using the tools, it's important to know what the tool you are using actually represents. So it's the actual host for the PowerShell, and at the end you have the actual at the back end you have the actual PowerShell engine. So those are two different things, and because of that, there might be some differences in how you run certain commandlets. Well, not commandlets, but let's say certain functionalities. For example, the transcript functionality in PowerShell or the verbose output might be dependent on the host, so you need to be careful about that. But I will not spend much time talking about here. There's a lot of documentation online, and our goal here is to, first of all, focus more on the Office 365 side of thinking and reporting, but if you are new to PowerShell, we've tried to include some additional links there that might help you in the journey. So first of all, it's highly recommended that you actually search online for the particular task that you are trying to achieve via PowerShell. You are more than likely will be able to find at least few examples on it. It's a very commonly used tool, so there are readily available scripts on the internet, so you can just go ahead and download them. Then there is this great course on the Microsoft Virtual Academy, which is hosted by the inventor of PowerShell, Mr. Jeffrey Snover. It's very detailed and can actually get you started. If you haven't watched the course, I highly recommend it. And then when it comes to actually working with PowerShell for Office 365, there are many great resources that our MVP colleagues have put out there on their personal blogs, on other sites. So I've just included a few links here. When you get the slides later on, feel free to just browse them, and you can see all sorts of different PowerShell script examples from those guys. Now, in order for you to be able to actually use PowerShell with Office 365, you need to connect to the service, and there are different types of PowerShell that you can use for the service. So for example, if you want to manage user accounts, you need to connect to the Azure AD part of the service. So you need the corresponding module. Nowadays, we actually have two different modules for this, but we'll talk about this a bit later on. The point of this slide here is to make sure that you understand that you actually might need to prepare your environment for running the PowerShell scripts. This might include installing and downloading and installing some modules, or making certain configurations and so on. Other very important thing to consider is the way that you will be authenticating to the service. And this is particularly important because most of the time when you are performing when you are running some PowerShell script or performing various tasks via PowerShell, you will be using some privileged account and even some global administrator account. So it's very important that this account is protected. And one of the best methods that we have in the service of protecting such accounts is the so-called Azure multi-factor authentication. Up until a year or maybe 2 years now ago, it was not possible to actually use PowerShell with such account. But nowadays, thanks to the modern authentication or the so-called ADAO library, we can actually authenticate to PowerShell via a admin account which is protected. So it's very important that you actually take advantage of this new functionality and make sure that all the credentials, all the accounts that you are using are actually protected with this, because we've seen previously examples of different PowerShell scripts where people actually hard code the credentials in them, and this is not really a very secure practice.
So anyway, on that note, that's exactly how I think it was Uber got hacked recently. They uploaded some of the credentials hard-coded into an open GitHub repository, and that allowed a lot of content to be leaked out. So this is a very important point. I've just had a question from the audience. Apparently your mic is going in and out of volume. I don't know if you're moving closer or further away from it.
I don't know, sorry, I'm on the headset, but I'll try to speak a bit louder here. Hopefully it will be better.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. So continuing on the connectivity bit, the actual way that you connect to the service will depend on the type of Office 365 environment you have. So as some of you know, apart from the global multi-tenant Office 365 environment, there are some dedicated environments or the government Office 365 government environment, and there are now the local clouds like the China cloud, like the Germany cloud, and so on. All of these you can use PowerShell with them, but the way that you connect to the service will be a bit different. So you will have to use a different endpoint to connect there. So it's important to know those details. The documentation is available online, and the link that we've included here is one of the better links there, which lists practically how to connect to most of the services and also includes some of those different endpoints. There is also a different PowerShell functionality for partners who can manage different Office 365 tenants on behalf of their customers. And one thing that I will also want to highlight later on in the session is there is a difference between connecting directly and executing some PowerShell commandlets and using the so-called PowerShell remoting. But we'll talk about this in just a bit, and hopefully the example that I've prepared there will help you better understand the difference. Okay, so moving on, this is just a slide with a bunch of links. This is the basically the latest versions of the different Office 365 related PowerShell modules. And I've tried to basically include all the modules that have support for modern authentication. So these are the modules that you should be using in the future because they allow you to actually use accounts which are protected by Azure MFA or any other form of two-factor authentication. So it's more secure. So please, when possible, make sure that you are using one of these modules. You will have the slides later on, so you can just use the links to download them. And this is another summary slide of sorts to basically compare the different functionality exposed within those modules when it comes to connecting to the service. This is important for the automation scenario, basically. So let's say you have some script which does a particular task in Office 365. Let's say activates a user account periodically or something like that. In order for you to be actually able to automate this, you want to put it as a scheduled task, for example, or put it in Azure automation and so on and have it run periodically. But for the script to run, you usually need to provide the credentials to authenticate. So the trouble with some of these MFA-enabled, ADAO-enabled modules is that they don't actually support passing credentials in plain form. When you issue the connect command, they will present a dialog to you, and you have to interactively type in your username or password there in the dialog, which in turn then might trigger the additional second factor authentication and so on. So this might actually be a trouble when it comes to automating stuff. But there are certain workarounds. So the first column here designates that the module actually supports multi-factor authentication. This is true for all the modules. I've just included the Exchange Online connectivity basically as a comparison there. Apart from the security and compliance, well, actually, it will probably support it in the future, but apart from it, all the modules now support passing the credentials, but simply passing the credentials doesn't mean that you will be able to connect because, as we mentioned, you might be using two-factor authentication. So My favorite way of making this work is to rely on this trusted IPs, trusted location feature, which you can configure for Azure MFA, basically meaning that every authentication attempt that comes from this particular network or IP or subnet, it will actually bypass the need of performing the second factor authentication, effectively allowing you to enter just the username and password to connect. So for every login attempt made outside of this network location, it will still be secured with two-factor authentication. So you get the benefits of both the increased security and the ability to actually automate or just put this into a script somewhere and run some task with it. Even in this sort of scenarios, it's highly recommended to not use any highly privileged accounts such as the global administrator, but use separate accounts which with the principle of least privileges applied there. So anyway, I would like to now show you a quick demo of the recently released Exchange Online PowerShell module, which supports this ADAO functionality. So in order for me to do this, I will just end the presentation and switch to the PowerShell ISE. So because of my screen resolution, I'm guessing that some of you guys might have some trouble seeing what's happening here. I can zoom in a bit more if needed. Let me know there in the comments if it's okay. So for those of you who have actually seen the module, it's this click once functionality. So basically it installs some application there in your local profile and puts an icon on the desktop. So when it comes to automation, it's not a very great approach because you have to actually go to the desktop, click the module to work with it. So what people have come up with is to locate the location, find out the location of this module by looking for the files there, and simply load it in PowerShell. So basically, this is what the first line here will do. So I'm simply looking for the directory in which these two files are present. So this is the actual connects model, and this is the DLL, the helper functions, which are included there. And what I'm then using is basically to load this module based on the path that I have just prepared here. So now that the module is actually loaded, I can still use the exact same functionality which is exposed if I double click the desktop button. So if I do the connect-xops session, it will prompt me for the credentials, and as soon as I enter the correct credentials here, I should be able to actually authenticate to the service. Now, because my computer, this is my home PC, I've configured it to bypass the two-factor authentication. Nothing interesting happens here, so I'm only entering the credentials. But if this was, let's say, some web cafe or some other machine, which is not in my trusted network, at this point that you just saw with the dialog here, I would have been forced to perform this second-factor authentication. So again, this is very important from the security perspective. But since I'm now on the trusted location, I connect just fine with the username and password. So what I want to show you here is basically how this relates to the old connectivity method. So if you remember previously, what we did was basically to run two commands there. So one was the new PS session and the other one was to import the session. So this is now automatically done via this, let's say, helper function. And we see here that the same type of remote session is created. And if we take a look at the properties of this remote session and compare it to the previous method, we will see that it's pretty much the same. So it's the same endpoint here. It's the same configuration. It's unfortunately the same no language mode, which is basically it's a set of restrictions which apply to this session and which limit you into the type of PowerShell syntax that you can use. So there's nothing new here, unfortunately. So you are still limited.
Got a question, Vasil, from the audience. They want to know if the trusted location still works when you're using an ADFS configuration or an ADFS setup.
Well, it depends on where you are actually performing the two-factor authentication, because with ADFS, you can have the multi-factor authentication server on premises, and there's a separate mechanism there for the trusted IPs. But if you are performing the multi-factor authentication against the Azure service, yes, it should apply. You should be, however, sending a special claim there with your ADFS syntax. Well, ask the person to email me later. I'll send him the article.
Well, maybe we can do it in the question and answer section as well.
Yeah.
Still got a few comments about your voice fading in and out, so if there's anything you can do about that.
Sorry, not sure what's happening here.
Technology, it's great.
For all the people, or
it's happening for me as well. So one last question about this: how will the PowerShell thing work with a multi-factor authentication as a third party, like an Okta or something like that? Is that still supported? Does it still work?
Yeah, as long as you are using this ADAO-enabled module, it supports. It's agnostic to the type of authentication that you are performing. You can use it against your own federation ADFS or third party. You can use it against the cloud. Should work just fine there. Well, of course, provided it's one of the supported providers for multi-factor authentication for Office 365. There's again an article which lists all the supported guys. Well, when we get to the comment section there, I should be able to provide you some links.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, then. So continuing here, just to show you the additional settings and what is different. So the authentication mechanism is basic. So again, means I'll authenticate it again using username and password. What's different here, however, is this new parameter added to the connection URI. So this basic out to all out conversion is what works the magic behind the scenes. So if we check the actual credentials that I've passed here on this session, so the username is nothing interesting here, is the same username. But if you check the actual password, instead of the few symbols that I tapped in the window, you can see that I have this long string, which is basically the access token that I just received from Azure AD in order to be able to authenticate against Exchange Online in this case. And so this is it basically. Now I'm connected and I can use, I can run the regular PowerShell command list that you are used to. It's pretty much the same from here on. So getting back to the slides here, let me see. So I think, yeah, sorry, forgot which slide is next. So one of the things that we want to leave as takeaway from this session is the extensibility bit that Alan just mentioned in the beginning. So one of the added benefits of using this is that you can perform various other types of actions which are not available via the, let's say, regular PowerShell command list. And in the Exchange world, one such example is using the Exchange Web Services API. So I just wanted to give the example here of how you can connect to the Exchange Web Services API using this new ADAO-enabled method, because again, it allows you to have the additional security layer here. So just to go quickly over the slide, and then I show you how it works. So basically, in order for you to be able to use this, what you need to do is to register an application in Azure AD, which has the necessary permissions to actually impersonate the users. So what you are doing is granting permissions on this application, and then you get the token, and as the user, you connect to this application. This application, on the other hand, has the necessary permissions to then use the impersonate functionality. And the good thing is that it actually respects the settings that you have configured in Exchange Online in terms of impersonation. So in case you are not aware, impersonation in general applies to every account in the company, but you can create a custom scope and limit it to only particular accounts. So if you have configured something like this, you will be able to take advantage of this functionality. So just to quickly show you how this is done. So what I've done is I've already registered this application in the service. So what I'm going to do now is basically get this token using the built-in methods in the ADAO library, and I'm basically just loading the DLL.
You're essentially loading a DLL that isn't usually a PowerShell DLL into that environment.
Exactly, and because PowerShell supports this functionality, now I can get a method directly from this, exposed directly within this DLL. And this is basically what the Azure AD guys at Microsoft have prepared for us as customers to work with. And so I'm basically using this additional method here to connect. So the function that I'm running is to acquire token for the Outlook.office 365 endpoint, and this is the application that I have. This is the application that I have used, and this is the return URL. So when I enter this line here, it will ask me for credentials. As usual, I will be providing my username and password here, and provided everything is okay, I should be able to get the authentication token. And as a next step, now I'm loading the actual Exchange Web Services DLL, so the commandlets contained there, the model, the objects, and so on. And now what I do is basically use this method to connect, to present the token that I just got from the authentication service, to present it to Exchange Online. And if I entered my credentials correctly, I should now connect to Exchange Web Services. So as an example of one of the things that you can do with this compared to regular PowerShell, I'm getting the list of delegates for this mailbox in particular. You can, in theory, get most of this information via PowerShell, but for example, this particular view private items bit, it's not exposed anywhere in PowerShell, so the only way for you to actually be able to look at it is to go to the user computer and ask him to open his Outlook and see whether this function is set up. And the Exchange Web Services in this case allow you to actually extend on this functionality. It's useful for other things, and we'll talk about them a little more. I just wanted to give you a quick example and enter basically some information here into this presentation, which you can then hopefully reuse to make sure that you are connecting using those newer methods, more secure methods. And now we turn to the reporting, Office 365 reporting part of the webinar, basically what is the original intention. And we want to basically talk about few important points. So what are the principles that you should follow when you are developing your own custom script and so on. So the first point that I want to make here is that in some cases, you might not actually need a script. There might be already a functionality out there which is available for you to use. So you might just need to do a simple research. For example, one of these scenarios is if you want to get an inventory of all the send-as permissions. Now, some of you that are somewhat familiar with PowerShell know that you can simply get the list of mailboxes, then for each mailboxes run this whoop, and then run the get recipient permission commandlet, again, this mailbox. But it turns out that this commandlet, actually, if you run it without any parameter, it will list all the entries across all the mailboxes. So with just this single execution, you can see here, hopefully, that it returned all this huge list of identities and the delegates that have actually been granted send-as permissions on them. Now, I can agree, of course, that this is not a very good-looking list. There's a lot of crap here that you probably don't need. So what we can do is, of course, prettify the output a bit. So use this client-side filter to simply filter out any entries that match the self one and the new SID here, and it will look a bit better. So like this, hopefully. Come on. Okay, so yeah, this list is now much better, and that's pretty much what you need from a report like this. You can simply now export it to CSV or copy paste it directly somewhere, and you're done with it. Of course, if you want to include some additional information, let's say the recipient type or display name or department or whatever, it's, well, you don't have this information here, so you need to add some additional properties, run some additional commandlet, and it gets more complicated. The point here is that, again, in some cases, you might be able to do something with the built-in functionality very quickly without you having to develop some more detailed scripts. But because it's a scripting seminar, let's actually start talking about some scripts. So Alan here will first showcase two of the scripts that he has published to the TechNet gallery. It's actually those are one of the most downloaded scripts in the gallery, and you can see now that the first one in particular is not something that complicated in general. But yeah, let's give Alan the opportunity to present here.
So can you see my screen, Vasil?
I can.
Okay, so yeah, as Vasil was saying, we've both been contributing to the Microsoft TechNet scripting center for many, many years now, and it's really surprising me. I mean, I wrote this script back in 2012, and all it does is show people who's last logged on to a mailbox, and it's still one of the most popular scripts in there. It's had many hundred, tens of thousands of downloads. It's a very simple script, and I mainly placed it up there to give people an idea of how to structure a script that could be run against Office 365. And unlike Vasil, I use VS Code or Visual Studio Code. It's like a cut down version of the Microsoft development tools. It's freely available on the Microsoft website, and I personally prefer it to the ISE. And then you'll be able to see it in action a bit here as well. Now, one of the other things I do differently from Vasil is I allow you to pipe in a username and a password into these scripts. And that doesn't work, obviously, with all of the modern authentication. You can have some workarounds in some cases, but it's really important to work out where do you want the information from, how are you going to authenticate against it, and that's where the part that Vasil worked on earlier in the session really comes into play. But my examples here are very basic. They're against Exchange Online, which supports passing in a username and a password to connect. And you can see in here, anything that's presented with a hash in the beginning is a comment. And I like to comment my code so that when I look at it again, like I wrote this 5 years ago, I need to remember what I was doing. My memory's not as great as it used to be. The way I code things has changed over that time. So it's always good to have these comments placed all through your script so that when you come back to look at them in the future, you know what you did. Or if, God forbid, you get hit by a bus, someone has to come in and work out what's going on. They can make it, understand what's going on a lot easier too. So here we have at the beginning of this script the ability to accept input parameters, and that means you can basically, like any other PowerShell commandlet, do hyphen and then a variable, and that gets passed into the script. So here we pass in the username of the person we want to connect to Office 365 against and the password. You should never store a password in a script in plain text. You should pass it through from a command line or from a file or credentials manager or something like that, so that if someone gets your script, like we mentioned before, the Uber hack was that somebody hard-coded some keys into a file somewhere. If someone gets hold of your script, they can't really do anything with it. They can just take credit for your imagination and coding ability, but not actually get access to any of your data. So what we're doing here is we're accepting parameters into this script, and we're accepting a username, a password, and we're also taking a user ID file, which is if we want to get a CSV list of users that we want to get this information for, instead of getting all of the users in our organization, we can just get that subset. On top of that, we can see that some of these variables are required in order for the script to work. Some are not. So if we don't pass an input file, it's just going to come in and get all of the users that are available in that tenant. Now, what we also have the ability to do in PowerShell is create functions. And if anyone's ever done any sort of coding or development, you'll know what a function is. For those of you that haven't, it's essentially a single block of code that's segmented off, and its job is just to do one thing. You pass some information into it, and it returns a result out. And the reason I create these different functions is so that I can just copy and paste them out of one script and paste them into another if I want to make some hybrid mega script. So if I want to get the delegates that Vasil was talking about beforehand using EWS, we can create a function for that, pull it out, or even load it in from another file and reuse it over and over again. So here we have at the, counterintuitively at the bottom of the script, we're going to start that by calling the main function. And if I expand that out in VS Code, we can see here that it sort of takes care of connecting to Office 365 and well, it hands off connecting to Office 365 and does all of the sort of work required for this. So if we want to get mailbox login information in any other script, I just copy this whole main function and reuse that again and again. So the important things that we want to do here is we call another function, our connect to Exchange Online function, because I use that all the time in my script. So I can just drop it in, it's ready to go. I just pass in the username and the password. It takes care of connecting and loading in everything like that. Now we have, standard constructs that you would expect in any kind of programming language. If something exists, then import the file. Otherwise, just go ahead, connect to get mailbox and fill up those users there. Again, we have the looping abilities that you would expect in any programming language. We can loop through every user in a collection of users, in this case, all the mailboxes in that tenant, or all the mailboxes from the file I provided, depending on how I populated that. And then we go and we get the last logon time for that particular mailbox. We get the actual username as well, and we merge all of this information together into sort of a comma-separated list, and then pipe that out using the out file commandlet into a CSV file. At the end of that, we just clean all that up. Now, this is how I structure all of my scripts. I create a function that does what I need it to do. If I do multiple different things, I'll create multiple functions, and then paste them all together and try and comment each line so that I know exactly what happens here. And if we run this, we'll actually get a CSV file, which here's one I prepared earlier, which shows me the UPN and the last logon date of all of the users in that tenant. Sure, as Vasile was saying, you can probably do this with a combination of PowerShell commandlets piped together with an export CSV at the end. But when you get into larger tenants, when there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users, if you break that script somehow, if the disconnection happens somewhere around the 40,000 user mark, or the machine runs out of memory and the PowerShell window closes, you need to go and collect all those users over again. By creating a script like that, you can pick up where you left off, you can handle that error intelligently within that script, and really make sure that it's more robust and more, the cloud, it's millions of kilometers away, imperial, so I guess miles. We don't know what internet routes we're going through each time. Anything along the way can drop and interrupt that connection, which then means that the PowerShell connection drops and you have to go and start all over again. Now we can really do a lot more complicated stuff with this, and if I fire up my second script here, what this one will do, and you can see it's structured in a very similar way, it pipes in a username and a password, and it allows us to essentially get a list of all of the email recipients in our tenant, and then find out how many messages they sent and received each day, and how much in terms of megabytes they sent and received each day. And what we're doing there is we're getting information from multiple different places in Office 365, and we're usually getting a lot of information, especially if you're a big tenant, as the kind of tenants that we are used to working with. If you've got a number of messages sent by every single person in your organization, you have 100,000 people in that organization, you're talking about a lot of rows of data. And the only way we can effectively, intelligently, and accurately get this information is to go and parse the mail traffic logs. So get a list of every single message that went in and out of that organization and match them up against people who actually work there. So what do we do here? We connect to Office 365 again. This is one of the times when I go against my own advice and I don't use my Connect to Exchange Online function. But then we go and we collect all of the recipients that are in that Exchange organization. That can be anything from contacts, users, mailboxes, that type of thing. And we store them in this recipients variable. We then go through each recipient and we create an empty table. It's almost like an empty database with each person's SMTP address in it, so that we have a list of everyone in the organization and essentially no messages sent or received. We're just creating a placeholder for everybody. Now, this get message trace commandlet allows you to look through every single email that came in and out of your organization. You can see the subject, the size, the recipients, just sort of meta information about that email. But it only allows you to see 5,000 results at a time, and it pages those results out over numerous pages. So in order to prevent Microsoft servers from getting smashed by companies like us just collecting all the information in one single hit, what we have to do is we have to break it up into what we call chunks. So again, we create a little loop here. We start at page number 1, and we go and collect the first 5,000 messages. We then increase that page number, add the messages into sort of a placeholder, so we bundle them all together into a batch. And we go again and again and again until there's no messages left. So we, if there's 16,000 messages, we'll have to do sort of 4 loops around this loop to collect all that information. We then disconnect from PowerShell because we don't need it. We all have all the information together inside our memory of our device that we're working on. And then we loop through every single one of these message items, and we try and match it using the contains thing. So are they a sender? Are they a sender in this organization? And if they sent a message, then if Alan Byrne sent a message, increase my message sent count by 1 and add in the size of that particular message. So you can see here we're taking information from get recipient, we're taking information from the get message trace, and we're smashing it together in this sort of database-like structure that you can see here. And we do that again for recipients. So we want to know how many messages you sent and how many messages you received. Once we have that all out, we format it in a nice pretty table so that we can push it out into a CSV file or out into a screen, essentially, so on screen. This this out grid view, sorry, is something I use a lot in my debugging, in my testing, to make sure that I've got the user the information that I really need there. So if I run this script now, I need to connect as admin to my tenant. So you can see one of the great things about VS Code is the same thing that happens in the ISE, is you can actually run the script directly in the editor, and it runs a little PowerShell session down here that you can interact with. So we see now it's connecting to Exchange Online, which can take a short period of time or a long period of time, depending on how the cloud gods are faring today. We collect all those recipients. It's only a small tenant, so this shouldn't take too long. And now we go through all the different pages of that message tracking log. And if we skip over to this window here, we see that out grid view that I was talking about before. It kind of creates an interactive visual representation of that database structure that I created in that script. At the same time, we're able to look at that information in a CSV file, and it's the exact same table, just formatted for something that computers and finance people can understand. So this is where my approach differs from Vasile's, because I connect to Office 365 in the script, because I'm coming at it from a point of view of I'm scheduling this as a task in a cron job or a scheduled task on a server. And Vasile, he uses a slightly different method for connection. And I think, Vasile, you're up next, aren't you?
Yep, thanks. Well, I tried to switch on some audio leveling options here, so hopefully you guys will be able to hear me better now. Unfortunately, my neighbors just started drilling, so you'll be hearing some drilling noises as well. So when those become a bit too annoying, I guess when you can just take over at some point and finish up for me. But yeah, let's give it a try. Okay, so I want to show you some demos of some of the scripts that we've recently put on the Motive site. So first, the first one is basically to prepare inventory of all the Office 365, sorry, all the aliases, the email addresses that you might be using in your Office 365 environment. So a lot of the same concepts that Alan talked about are used into the script. So I have the parameter block on top, so I can pass each of these individual parameters to the script and to the functions within the script, meaning that I can, for example, configure this script to run by default against only the user mailboxes, and I can use the different parameters there to include other types of mailboxes, for example, shared mailboxes, root mailboxes, and so on. Then Alan already talked about the functions and the fact that you can actually reuse them and so on. And because I'm actually used to reusing my connectivity function, I'm not including any connection to Exchange Online here. I do, however, check if a connection is present, and if it's not present, I will provide some error message there. So these are the two lines here, basically, which handle this. If no connection is detected, it will provide you a link to the documentation there, and so you can select the method to connect to Exchange Online, which is appropriate for your specific organization. Now, one other thing that I do here, and which is especially important when you are running PowerShell scripts against larger environments, is I take advantage of this invoke commandlet. What this means basically is I'm going and interacting directly with the session established on the Exchange server and running the commandlets there. Now, this has the benefit that I can select only the specific properties I want. So I specify them here via the select object commandlet, and only those properties will actually be returned as a result of executing this commandlet. Now, it might not seem like a great deal, but if you are running this script against thousands and thousands of objects, every little bit adds. So if you run by default the get recipient or get mailbox commandlet, you know that it returns probably 100, 200 different properties. By limiting the amount of output that you get from this commandlet, not only the script will execute faster, it will take less memory, it will take less network data. So in general, it will greatly improve your code. On the bad side, however, there are some restrictions which you have to unfortunately work around when you are running this invoke commandlet approach, because then you are faced with this no language mode that the implicit remoting PowerShell session is running, which basically limits you to only the commandlet. So you cannot you cannot use any variables, you cannot use your custom commandlets and so on. So it's very important to actually do some research before you start running this, but hopefully the examples that we have provided there in our recent articles will be able to get you started with this. And the rest of the script is basically pretty much what Alan showed above. So I have an array of all the objects, then I whoop into each of the objects, and then I prepare some sort of output depending on the goal that I have here. So my preferred method, for example, is to store everything in this global variable. So I'm taking advantage of this commandlet bindings command parameter, which you can insert into any function, and it makes certain parameters available for this function. This example of this parameter is this out variable. So basically means when I run this custom function that I've created with the out variable parameter, it will store the output in this particular variable. So if I just simply run the script here, I'm now connected to Office 365 because of the previous example. It outputs the list of accounts and their corresponding aliases on the screen, but it also stores them into this global var aliases variable. And now what I can do is I can actually work with this variable and let's say select only the recipient and recipient. And if I want, I can add some additional details. I can sort it differently. I can do basically different operations before actually exporting it to a CSV file. But if you prefer to simply export the output to CSV and do this operation afterwards in Excel or whatever tool, you can of course just take the different approach and export everything directly.
So that allows you to work with the data inside PowerShell after running that script.
Exactly.
Excellent.
So as another example I want to cover here is another recent script we published on the Cognitive side is basically a script to get inventory of all the folder level permissions that you might have in your organization. Again, the structure is very similar. We have the parameter block on top, we have the different functions and so on. But what I'm doing differently here is to give you a progress message, which basically is this part of the script, which indicates how many objects the script has gone over. So you know, kind of have an indication of how well it's progressing, how much time it will take, and so on. And another different thing that I'm doing here is adding an artificial delay to the script in order to avoid throttling. Now, there was a question previously into the session, how do you actually handle throttling when you are running commandlets against a large number of recipients in Office 365? This method is not particularly good. I mean, it's simple hack. I'm adding an artificial delay after getting each individual object. So yeah, it's crap, but it actually can help you in some situation. If you want to properly handle this, the Microsoft guys have actually released a very detailed script which is called run robust
Start robust cloud command.
Thank you, Alan. And we will talk about it in a bit more detail later on. So just let's see if this script will actually execute. And in the meantime, I wanted to touch on one other thing that I'm doing differently here in the script. So one of the parameters which I have made available here on the top is basically to specify a different sort of output. So it's again an example of how you can take advantage of parameters in general to reuse your code where possible. So in the previous script, we were providing the recipient type, so user mailboxes, all mailboxes, you decide what to run the script against. In this case, I also have this functionality to specify the recipient type, but I'm also providing a different output based on my preference. So some people might want to get the list of folder permission in this case on so each entry will be individual line in the output. Others might want to have a bit of condensed output, so you have one line for all the entries for a particular mailbox and folder. And this is basically taking advantage of a parameter. So I'm simply doing a check here whether I have used this parameter when I'm running the script. And if I have provided the parameter, the output will be a bit different compared to the other one. And another, just a simple example of how you can handle throttling and in general the well-known problem that you might actually get disconnected if you are running a commandlet against a large number of objects in Exchange Online, is that you can simply take advantage of this new append functionality introduced to the export CSV commandlet. So in general, you can, if I simply uncomment this line here, it will make my script run to the CSV file after each individual iteration of, so after each individual folder in this collection that I have prepared already. So the script is now actually done running, and we can see how the output looks like. So I have a mailbox, I have the mailbox type, and I have a particular folder. Now, because again, I'm outputting this into the console, it doesn't really look this great, but if I can simply just reuse the var permissions variable, I can sort it, I can format it as table, which will be a bit easier on the eyes. And yeah, you can see here, so I have for my mailbox, I have several folders on which I have delegated permissions, and those particular users have this type of permissions and so on. And yeah, that's the basic idea of the script. We have the detailed article published there, and the code is available online. So if you
all the scripts that we're talking about are available on the Cogmotive blog, is that right? And in the handbook?
Yes, and also on the TechNet gallery, and I've included the direct links here. So if you want to take a look at one of the scripts, just use the direct link and download it. And of course, you can also just modify it to better suit your needs. It's just an example to get you started.
So the PowerPoint presentation will be sent to all attendees afterwards, but we've also uploaded it to the handout section now inside the webinar itself, so you can download it now if you wish. So we've got about 6 minutes left till the top of the hour. What are we going to go?
Okay, so I will then just skip over. Those are basically some summary slides summarizing what we talk about and giving you more examples of tasks that you can actually perform with PowerShell. It's not an exhaustive list, and one of the goals of this seminar is actually ask you what kind of tasks, what kind of reports, for example, what type of bulk actions do you feel that the Office 365 Admin Center, for example, is lacking currently? At what types of actions do you want to see? Do you want to be able to do against your users? For example, one of the things I've seen in pretty much every company I've worked with is to configure some sort of mailbox level settings after you have actually provisioned the mailbox. It can be just enabling the archive or setting some quota or putting the mailbox on hold and so on, but pretty much every organization that I worked with had this custom mailbox enablement script, and it was running them. So we've prepared some examples there in the slides, which can give you hopefully some ideas of things that you can optimize in your particular organization, but we are also interested in hearing your input on what kind of tasks do you feel are good to automate, or what kind of reports are you looking for?
So there are some questions already being typed. We are trying to unmute everybody now. One of the ones that's been asked is something that keeps me up at night. Get mobile device statistics against a large tenant of, say, 200,000 users. What's the best way that you've seen for people automate that? And I've got some of my own suggestions there as well. But if you go first.
Well, the method that I prefer basically is to use the just the actual commandlet to get to use the get mobile device. Sorry, get mobile.
I think it's get mobile device first, and then.
Yeah. So if you run the commandlet, just the commandlet, it will return the actual list of all the devices. The other method is to whoop against each mailbox. So for each mailbox, then pipe it to the get commandlet to get the list of devices and so on, which unfortunately results in a quite larger execution time for the script. So I tried to kind of optimize it by simply taking advantage of the fact that this commandlet returns all the devices already. But then again, we are back to the issue that we discussed in the beginning there. It doesn't actually have all the needed properties there. Yeah, it does kind of have the reference to the owner of the device, but it's in this distinguished name
Well, if you
type
want to
of.
get the last active sync time and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so then you are faced again with a similar problem. If you want to add some additional properties, then you have to run some additional command line, and it gets more and more complicated. But if you are using tools such as the reports that we have, we as a company prepare, we actually have this data prepared for you already, so we don't actually have to get it one more time just for the purposes of this particular report. We can simply get the devices there, and you can use the data that we already have stored in our tables there to surface the other properties, which is one way of doing this, but you either have to use a third-party tool such as ours, or you have to have your own database uh, to keep a record of those settings, or you can actually get the additional properties by running additional commandlets, which unfortunately results in a not so good experience.
So Vasile's right. We do in the Quadratech Radar product get mobile device statistics for millions of mobile devices a day, and on that, what we recommend for large tenants is creating service accounts for running PowerShell scripts against. And you can create, say, 5 service accounts and then distribute the workload. So you divide all of your users across, divided by 5, and then you run a subset of those users against each service account. And that helps with some of those throttling questions there. So let me just scroll through. Vasily, you're going to have to help me out here. We have questions coming in at quite a rate.
Yeah, I'm trying to scroll as well, but it's not working as expected.
So we have another question about how do I get the last sync time for a particular device. That is with the get mobile device statistics commandlet. Unfortunately, that information is not currently exposed in the Microsoft Graph or any of those places as far as I know. So PowerShell is unfortunately the only place you can get that information out. We do have a script, do we not, Vasile, about getting mobile device sync times. I think it may be one of the ones we have in the TechNet page. As I said, the slides will be posted later on. We will be able to provide you with a list of all those scripts as well, including the one that does the active sync devices.
So I saw that somebody here mentioned that they are also using this robust command sort of wrapper function to run scripts against larger number of objects. So I just pasted the link directly there into the chat. Hopefully people can see. But it's also available here as part of the slides. We wanted to cover some more information about this, but unfortunately we are running out of time. Please use the link there. Go to the blog post. It's very detailed. Unfortunately, it's not panacea. I mean, it will not help you in all possible scenarios, but it will get you started, and you can optimize some other things. One of the things that we wanted to cover basically is that you should be using the built-in filtering capabilities, the server-side ones in particular, wherever possible, to just again make sure that you just get all the needed information and nothing else. And this will not only help you to run the script to run faster, but it actually will make it more reliable because you will not be prone to disconnects or the throttling and so on. Okay, let's see other questions.
So there's some feedback here from an attendee saying that get mobile device statistics has to call into each mailbox to get the information. And yeah, as we know, that is increasingly it's intensive for Microsoft to provide that information. And apparently they also recommend splitting up multiple service accounts. It sounds like we maybe have to do another webinar on how to optimize PowerShell scripts. I know we had it as a topic in this particular webinar, but it sounds like it's a topic of its own. In fact, I gave a talk at IT Dev Connections last year about this there, which I'm not sure if it's publicly available or not.
So yeah, one of the other things that we wanted to talk about is basically the graph, the data that you can get from the Graph API, and in particular the new reports that are available there, which again might be a solution for some of the cases, but in most cases people will want some custom report with just these particular fields which are not available there. So yeah, you are pretty much stuck with running PowerShell scripts, and making sure that you optimize them as much as possible is a very important topic. So yeah, I guess we should probably schedule another session and focus only on this particular task and not try to cover that much information in just an hour.
Exactly. So the information in this webinar has been incredibly technical, and it was very hard to jam a lot of it into just 1 hour. For that reason, we've created a PowerShell scripting handbook. Is that right, Vasil? Is there a link available now, or are we going to be sending that out afterwards?
No, unfortunately, the link will be available tomorrow, but every participant and every registrant for the webinar should receive it directly into their email, and it will be available on the Cogmotive site tomorrow after the recording has been posted as well.
And if you follow @Cogmotive on Twitter, if you have any more questions that you'd like to ask after we run out, I realize people have more important things to do in their day than to listen to two people drone on about PowerShell. So if you have any questions at any time, why not tweet at us @Cogmotive, and we'll see if we can get an answer. We have a company full of MVPs and PowerShell scripting experts who will be able to jump on that and give you some advice, hopefully.
Yeah, and feel free to just write some comments on the actual scripts there in the TechNet Gallery or on the Cogmotive site with the blog articles explaining what we are trying to achieve and why we are doing this particular task in this particular method. If you want some additional scripts prepared there, we are always looking to provide more articles. So with the move to Quadrotech, the Cogmotive site is now focused only on being this sort of knowledge center for Office 365 related issues. We will not be charging you for any of this. So if we see that it's an interesting topic, and if we see that other people are also interested in getting, let's say, this particular type of report or solving this particular task with PowerShell or anything similar, we will be preparing some quick article and some sample script on how you can get started. Of course, it will be not a complete solution because we don't know how your particular organization operates and so on. There will be specifics there, but we should be able to help you at least get started with those tasks.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Sorry if we didn't answer your questions specifically. They came far quicker than this interface allowed us to respond, but thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.